In the last video, we started our discussion on fiscal policy. So we started with a definition, right? Fiscal policy is the federal government's policy on taxes, spending, and borrowing, right? It's designed to affect aggregate demand and ultimately the macroeconomy. Right? Then we went on to look at the question, how/why should/does fiscal policy work? And while discussing that, we talked about two effects. Crowding out, which is when increases in government spending decrease private spending. And we also talked about the multiplier effect, which is when increases in government spending, right, or at least an initial increase in government spending leads to an increase in private spending. All right, so what we're going to start this video with is a look at the multiplier effect graphically, right? So I've already put up kind of our baseline here. Oh, I forgot something, didn't I? I forgot the short run aggregate supply curve. All right, now we have it. Okay, so now this is our kind of our base starting point, a long run equilibrium, and we are going to look at a negative shock to aggregate demand, right? So let's say that our consumers are pessimistic about their economic prospects, so they start saving more money. That decreases the consumption spending growth rate, which decreases the velocity of money growth rate, which ultimately decreases aggregate demand. All right, so we're going to put in our new aggregate demand curve, AD1, and we're going to see that we have a short run, a new short run equilibrium. All right, oop, that needs to be a 0. All right, so we see a decrease in our real GDP growth rate. We also see a decrease in our inflation rate. Now, if we were to do nothing, over time, consumers and producers would adjust to this new inflation rate, right? We'd get a new short-run aggregate supply curve, and eventually we would wind up down here, right, where this new aggregate demand curve intersects our long-run aggregate supply curve, right? So we would return to the solo growth rate. So we'd have to have lower real output in the short run until we got back to the solo growth rate, and it would also leave us with lower levels of inflation. All right. Well, the government might not want to have to wait through all of they don't want to wait through the short run, and they want to get back to this original solo growth rate. They don't want to go through that low period or a period of lower economic output. So what they are going to do is they are going to increase spending. All right, so the government increases spending. All right, but what they're hoping for, right, is that they don't have to put in the full amount to get us from AD1 to AD0, right, from our new aggregate demand curve back to our old one, right? So they're going to try to rely on the multiplier effect, right? So we have our our initial increase in government spending, right? And honestly, this is a little farther than I normally would have drawn it, but that G is kind of big how I drew it, right? But we have this initial increase in government spending, right? That boosts the economy partway there. And then, right, once all of these work, or whoever's getting this money, all right, through this this increase in government spending, so whether it's a kind of public works project, right, so something like a dam, which we discussed in the last video, or some other method of increasing spending, right, as long as the money is getting to people that will spend it, right? Then consumption spending, the consumption spending growth rate will also go up, right, pushing us, and I guess I should, so those were for the growth rates. These are for kind of our aggregate demand. All right, so we have that initial increase in the government spending growth rate. Then that government spending growth rate hopefully increases incomes, and those incomes get spent on other goods. Then that increases the incomes for other people, right? Whoever is selling the goods or working to produce the goods, right? So they spend their money, so on and so forth, right? Until hopefully we get back to our original aggregate demand curve, right? And back to this long run equilibrium without having to kind of go to a new one, right? Instead of having to kind of wait and kind of go through a period of time where we have lower economic growth, right? If we can hit it just right, we can just jump back to where we were. All right, but that is our model graphically. And in just a second, I'm going to give you all a little bit longer to write that down and anything else you need, although I guess you could just pause the video. But I'll go ahead and start talking about something else, so that's probably not that helpful. All right, but what the multiplier effect kind of is based off of, right, or at least a way of looking at it, is what's called the multiplier. So the multiplier is a number that could be kind of estimated for different types of fiscal policy to see, how much of an effect it will have, because not all kind of policies are created equal. Depending on what you are doing, it's going to determine kind of how much of a multiplier, how effective it is. All right. All right, so as I said, the multiplier this is a number signifying the change in private spending that results from a change in government spending. All right, so essentially it's a number telling us the magnitude of the multiplier effect for any kind of policy, right? For any kind of policy change. That E is going to bother me. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and erase that so we can get everything on here kind of all at once. All right, these next things. All right, so if the multiplier equals 0, then all government spending crowds out private spending. All right, so this would be the situation where if the government increases spending by $100 million, then it's going to crowd out $100 million worth of private spending, right? So really, if we have a multiplier of 0 or even really close to 0, fiscal policy is probably not a great option, because we're not going to have, really, if it's 0, then we're not going to see any change to kind of our real output, right? We're not going to change anything, right? Or really, we're just not going to change aggregate demand, so that in effect does not change output, right, in the short run. Right, so that's when our multiplier is 0. Right, then if the multiplier equals 1, then no private spending is crowded out. All right, so in this scenario, you know, that's not how you spell crowded. In this scenario, this would be government increases spending by $100 million, right? And then we see a $100 million worth increase in aggregate demand, right? So there's no extra effect, there's no increase in private spending that goes with that, right? But none of the private spending is crowded out either. Right. Then lastly, if the multiplier is greater than 1, then government spending causes, or increases in government spending cause additional private spending. Right, so this is where we would actually see that multiplier effect, right? Say the government increases spending by $100 million, right? So we get that $100 million worth of kind of increased aggregate demand, right? But we also get an additional boost to consumption spending or investment spending, right? Wherever it may be, right? So maybe $100 million increase in government spending, maybe net leads to a $150 million increase worth of aggregate demand, right? So 100 million from the government, right? Then 50 million from the increase in private spending, right? So that is what we're looking at there, right? So the multiplier kind of goes from 0 on up, right? If you're between 0 and 1, depending on kind of where you're at in that, there is going to be some crowding, right? Crowding out depending on where you're at. If you're closer to 0, there's going to be more crowding out. If you're closer to 1, there's going to be less crowding out, right? But until you actually get to 1, there will be crowding out, right? Then, of course, at exactly 1, right, no private spending is crowded out. But then once you go past 1, right, kind of larger numbers, right, then that's when we see that multiplier effect actually happening and seeing that additional private spending. All right, so the higher the multiplier, the larger the increase in spending. All right, so there are a couple of things that are going to make the multiplier larger, right, or at least make it likely that the multiplier is larger. All right, so I'm just going to list some of them. One something we've already mentioned, many unemployed resources, right? If we have many unemployed resources, then we are going to have a larger multiplier, right? Or at least when we have many unemployed resources in whatever whatever sector we are increasing spending in, right? Similarly, the next one is that spending can be targeted on the unemployed. Right, so again, kind of going back to the idea of the government building a dam, right? If all of the dam builders are already working, which that seems unlikely because how many dams are being built other than by the government? But regardless, right? If all of the construction workers or all of the dam builders, what have you, if they all have jobs already, then building a dam is going to have a very small multiplier. Actually, if they all have jobs, then the multiplier will be 0. Right? But if you can focus spending on a sector or an industry where there are many unemployed resources, we're going to have a bigger multiplier. Right? If we haven't really talked about taxes yet, right? But if tax cuts go to people who will spend it immediately, we're going to have a larger multiplier, right? So if you're going to be using tax cuts, you want to give tax cuts to people that are going to spend that money on goods and services right away. You don't want to give them to people that are just going to potentially put that money in the bank, right? That extra money, right? And not actually spend it, all right? So that's why more often than not, you would want to target tax cuts to low income households or even maybe middle income, right, households, but you wouldn't want to necessarily target tax cuts to high income households because they've probably already, they've got enough money that they can take care of all the things, all the goods and services they want, and then also save it, right? Whereas a low income household, right, that extra money that they save from these tax cuts, right, they're more likely to spend it immediately. Right, and then there are some other ones. We're not going to go too deep into them, but I just wanted to talk a little bit more about what that multiplier is, right? What can affect it. There are some other things that your book goes into, like how if the government can tax savings, right, we can have a larger multiplier because that discourages people from actually saving the money that's either they get from tax cuts or get from, say, a stimulus package, all right? And so on and so forth, all right? But really the big thing is who's going to spend the money, right? If we're going to do something to kind of give people jobs and give them higher incomes, right, we want to find people that are unemployed, right? Just unemployed, right? So then they get that job, they start spending that money immediately. Same goes with anything like a tax cut if you can target it. Right, it's best if you can target these things. Right? If you can target a tax cut, then you want to tax it or target it towards people that will spend it immediately. I just thought of something, but I don't want to make this video longer. All right, well, we won't do that. So we'll just go ahead and in the next video, we're going to look at some problems, all right, or some issues facing fiscal policy or facing the Fed, or not the Fed, that's monetary policy, facing the government when they are trying to use fiscal policy. All right, but that's in the next video. I will see you then.